Welcome. This is Vacation Bible Stories, and I'm Pastor Dave here at Perry Methodist. We're doing these for the Bright Star Parish, and today we are doing the story of Joseph. And actually, we're doing the whole what is called the Joseph cycle. I'll begin with Genesis 37, reading out of the Children's Bible, and we'll begin at the beginning of the story of Joseph. Jacob lived in Canaan. That would be Joseph's father. He had 12 sons, but Joseph was his favorite. For he was the first son of Rachel, whom Jacob had loved above all of his other wives. To show Joseph just how much he loved him, Jacob had a wonderful coat made for him, a long-sleeve robe covered with colorful embroidery. His brothers were jealous. But what really angered them was when he began to tell them about his dreams. He said, "Last night I dreamed that we were collecting sheaves of grain when suddenly a sheaf stood up straight and all of yours bowed down before it." "What are you saying?" growled his brothers. "You trying to rule over us someday? Be off with you." Joseph had another dream. This time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me, he told his family. Even Jacob became cross when he heard about Joseph's latest dream. "Do you really believe that your mother and I and all your brothers are going to bow down before you? Don't get too big for your boots." But Jacob did wonder to himself about what the dream might mean. Joseph's brothers had had enough. What with the fabulous coat and now these dreams, they felt the time had come to get rid of their annoying brother. And one day, when they were out in the fields, the brothers set upon him, tearing off his precious multicolored coat, throwing him in a deep pit. Then they sat down nearby to have lunch, deaf to his cries for help. Shortly after, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passing by on their camels on their way to Egypt, and quick as a flash, they decided to sell Joseph to the traders. They took off his beautiful coat, smeared it with the blood of a goat, and afterward they trooped home with long faces and showed the coat to their father, saying that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Jacob was heartbroken at the death of his beloved son. Joseph had been sold to one of Pharaoh's officials, a man named Potiphar, but God was still looking after him. He was clever and hardworking, and soon Potiphar decided to place him in charge of his whole household. But the peaceful times did not last long. Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph. He was handsome and strong. Joseph would have nothing to do with her advances. But one day, when he pulled away from her, in haste, he left his coat behind him when her husband came back. She showed him the coat and told him that Joseph had come into her bedroom to take advantage of her and had run away when she screamed. Potiphar was furious and threw poor Joseph into prison. Sometime later, both Pharaoh's wine steward and chief baker angered the Pharaoh, who were likewise thrown into prison. And one night, both men had strange dreams. They were puzzled, and Joseph said to them, "My God will be able to tell you what your dreams are." And the wine steward went first. "In my dream, I saw a vine and 3 branches covered with grapes. I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup." And Joseph said that within 3 days, Pharaoh would pardon him and take him back. And he asked the steward to remember him. Now the baker was anxious to tell his dream too. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread," he said, "but the birds were eating Pharaoh's pastries." And Joseph was sad. "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will cut off your head, and the birds will eat your flesh." And things turned out just as Joseph had foretold. In 3 days, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and on that day, he pardoned the cupbearer and gave him back his job. Joseph asked the wine steward to remember him when he got out of prison. But 2 years passed before the Hebrew slave crossed his thoughts. And it happened like this. One night Pharaoh had a strange dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came 7 cows, healthy and fat. They grazed on the reeds. And after them 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile and stood beside them. And then the thin cows ate the fat cows, and yet looked just as thin and sickly as before. Pharaoh had another dream. 7 healthy heads of grain were growing on a single stalk. 7 more heads of grain sprouted. These were thin and scorched by the wind, and the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. In the morning, Pharaoh was worried. He sent for all of his magicians and wise men, but none could interpret his dream. It was then that the wine steward remembered Joseph. The slave was brought before the mighty Pharaoh, who asked him to explain his dream. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to the Pharaoh, "but God will be able to explain." And once Pharaoh had told his dream, Joseph replied, "These 2 dreams are really one and the same. The 7 cows and the 7 heads of grain are 7 years. The land will be blessed with 7 years of healthy crops and bountiful harvest, but they will be followed by 7 years of dreadful famine, and you will need to plan carefully to prepare what lies ahead. Pharaoh spoke to his advisors, and then he turned to Joseph, saying, "It is clear to me that you are the man that we need. Since God has made all this known to you, I will put you in charge of my land, and you will be second only to me in all of Egypt." And with that, Pharaoh put his own signet ring on Joseph's finger, a gold chain around his neck, and dressed him in fine linen.
Hey, Pastor.
Yes.
Why did everybody dislike Joseph?
He was favored by his father. And I suppose, sometimes we imagine that one parent favors us over another parent, or that a teacher favors us over over our classmates, or our classmates may feel that. And so they were, I suppose the word would be, they were jealous of him, envious of him.
But Joseph didn't really ever do anything wrong, other than maybe he was a little bit, was he even full of himself, Pastor?
Precocious.
Was he stuck up? Was he like that toward his, do you get that sense that he was like that?
I think maybe. I mean, that's part of the reasons that his brothers were mad at him. Certainly their response was disproportionate to his offense. That the fact that you don't like somebody doesn't mean you sell them into slavery. But I think part of the story of Joseph is Joseph maturing as well. I mean, it's about him growing up. And so kind of from being a prideful little kid to being, he went through all those traumas, all those trials of being first sold as a slave, and then put in prison. And I suppose if there were a theme that ran through that, is that ultimately Joseph was favored by God. I mean, that was why God gave him those dreams and gave him the power to interpret dreams. And so it's probably notable at the end that when he is asked by Pharaoh about his dream, he says, "I can't interpret your dream, but God can." That's a humble thing to say. I'm not sure Joseph, years before, would have said that. So.
No, I don't think he would have. I think he was very much his brother's little brother. He was kind of a
we all have
pesty
little brother. At least many of us have little brothers.
Yeah, right.
Little sisters that drive us crazy.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Pastor.